It was supposed to be just another ordinary afternoon. The sun hung high over the city, its golden rays casting long shadows across the quiet sidewalk. The streets bustled with their usual rhythm, people chatting on phones, rushing to meetings, or simply enjoying their lunch breaks. Among them was Darius Carter, a 32-year-old black man with an easy smile and a calm demeanor. Darius worked as a graphic designer, and he had taken the afternoon off to meet a friend at Willowbrook Cafe, a cozy spot known for its artisanal coffee and warm ambience. He walked into the cafe, the familiar scent of roasted beans and fresh pastries greeting him. His friend, Jordan, wasn't there yet, so he found a corner seat and scrolled through his phone while waiting. It was the kind of quiet, unassuming moment that no one would think twice about. And yet, within the next hour, Darius's life would be turned upside down. Across the room, a woman sat alone at a table, occasionally glancing around. Her name was Rebecca Langley, a 28-year-old marketing consultant. She was dressed in business casual, her blonde hair neatly styled, a designer handbag resting beside her. From the outside, she looked like any other professional taking a break. But inside, anxiety swirled through her mind. She had just misplaced her phone, and panic was beginning to set in. She rifled through her bag, checked her pockets, even patted the seat beside her. Nothing. Her heart pounded. She was certain she had placed it on the table just minutes ago. Had someone taken it? Her eyes darted around the cafe, scanning faces, movements. And then, they landed on Darius. He had stood up, stretched, and now casually slipped his phone into his pocket. Something about the motion triggered something in Rebecca's mind. An assumption, a gut feeling, a fear. Her missing phone. A black man. A subconscious bias, formed over years of societal conditioning, whispering an accusation before she even had time to think rationally. Her breathing quickened. She stared at him for a moment too long, her thoughts racing. And then, before she knew it, she was walking toward the counter, her voice sharp, urgent. "Excuse me. I think that man just stole my phone." Heads turned. The barista, mid-pour, froze. Conversations died down, all eyes shifting toward Darius. He looked up, confused, catching the sudden shift in attention. "Sorry," he asked, his brows knitting together. Rebecca pointed at him. "My phone. It was right here on my table. And now it's gone." Her voice trembled slightly, a mix of panic and conviction. "I saw you take something just now." Darius blinked, taken aback. Wait, what?" He let out a small, bewildered laugh, as if trying to grasp the absurdity of the accusation. "I didn't take anything." Rebecca's face hardened. "I saw you," she insisted. Murmurs rippled through the cafe. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. A couple sitting nearby subtly edged away. The tension in the air thickened, a silent but undeniable shift occurring. Darius's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of every gaze on him, scrutinizing, judging. His hands instinctively clenched at his sides, not out of aggression, but out of the sheer frustration of the situation. The barista hesitated before speaking. "Maybe we should check first. Are you sure you didn't misplace it?" Rebecca's expression tightened. "I know it was here, and now it's not." She turned back to Darius, her eyes sharp with certainty. "If you didn't take it, then prove it. Show me your pockets." Darius inhaled sharply, an unsettling chill running down his spine. He could feel the pressure building, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. He had nothing to hide. His phone was his own, his pockets empty otherwise. But the very demand itself, the expectation that he had to prove his innocence, stung in a way that words couldn't quite describe. A man in a suit, sitting nearby, muttered, "If he didn't take it, why not just show her?" Another woman whispered to her friend, shaking her head, as if silently condemning him already. Darius exhaled slowly. "I don't have to prove anything to you," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "I didn't take your phone." Rebecca scoffed, frustration flashing across her face. "If you're innocent, why won't you just cooperate?" And then, before Darius could react, she pulled out her own phone. Not the missing one, but a different phone, her work phone. The realization dawned on her in real time, her lips parting slightly as she stared down at the device in her hand. For a brief moment, silence filled the cafe. It was almost comical, except it wasn't. It was terrifying. But before anyone could acknowledge her mistake, before she could stammer out an apology, the front doors swung open. Two police officers stepped inside. Rebecca had already called them before making the accusation. Darius turned to see them approach, the weight of the situation crashing down on him all at once. His stomach churned. His hands instinctively felt clammy. He had done nothing wrong, and yet, in that moment, he could feel the familiar, haunting sense of vulnerability. The officer in front, a stocky man with a serious expression, immediately addressed him. "Sir, we got a report of a theft." His voice was even but authoritative. "We need you to step outside with us." Darius's jaw clenched. He forced himself to keep his voice steady. "This is a misunderstanding." Rebecca was suddenly quiet, her face paling slightly as she realized what she had set into motion. One of the officers turned to her. "Ma'am, are you the one who called?" Rebecca hesitated, just for a second, before nodding. "Yes," she admitted, her voice smaller than before. I thought he took my phone." "Did he?" the officer pressed. Rebecca fumbled for words. I don't know, but I really thought." Darius exhaled sharply, his frustration barely contained. "Are you serious?" He gestured around. "I've been sitting here waiting for my friend. I didn't take anything." The officer turned back to Darius. "Sir, I'm going to need to check your pockets." Darius looked at them both, his pulse hammering. This wasn't just about a missing phone anymore. It was about something far bigger, something that had played out countless times before, with consequences that were often irreversible. The silence in the cafe was deafening. People watched, some pretending to look away but sneaking glances. Rebecca bit her lip, her gaze darting between the officers and Darius, as if realizing, for the first time, the weight of what she had done. And just when it seemed like the situation was spiraling beyond control, a voice from behind the counter broke the tension. "Wait," the barista called out. "We have security cameras." For the first time since this nightmare began, hope flickered in Darius's chest. The moment the barista mentioned security cameras, a shift rippled through the room. People who had been silently watching suddenly straightened in their seats. Even the officers exchanged a glance. The promise of objective evidence changed everything. Darius felt a flicker of relief, but it was quickly tempered by the knowledge that this never should have escalated to this point. He shouldn't have needed a camera to validate his innocence. His word should have been enough. But he knew, deep down, that it rarely was. One of the officers, Officer Ramirez, turned to the barista. "You have cameras?" His tone was neutral, but there was a slight edge of reluctance. The young barista nodded. "Yeah, they cover the whole cafe, including the seating area." He gestured toward the small black domes mounted on the ceiling. "Everything's recorded." Rebecca paled. She had been confident, so certain, when she made her accusation. But now she wasn't so sure. "I mean," she started, her voice quieter than before. "It really looked like he took something." Darius let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Looked like, that's all it takes for you to call the cops on me." His frustration boiled beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. The second officer, a taller man named Officer Harding, exhaled. "All right, let's check the footage before we go any further." But Ramirez wasn't convinced just yet. He turned back to Darius. "Sir, I still need to check your pockets." Darius's relief curdled. His shoulders stiffened, and his hands instinctively curled into fists, not in aggression, but in restraint. "No," he said firmly. That single word sent a shockwave through the room. A few people gasped quietly. The tension thickened, suffocating. "Excuse me." Ramirez's tone sharpened. "I said no," Darius repeated, meeting the officer's gaze. "You're not going to treat me like a suspect when we both know I didn't do anything wrong. You have security footage. Look at that first." Officer Harding shifted, clearly considering Darius's point, but Ramirez's expression hardened. "We have reasonable suspicion." "No, you don't," Darius cut in. His voice wasn't raised, but there was power in it now. "You have an assumption. That's all this is." He gestured toward Rebecca, who shrank under the attention. "She assumed I took something. And instead of questioning her assumption, you're here treating me like I'm guilty before you even have proof." For the first time, Rebecca truly absorbed the weight of her actions. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she said nothing. Ramirez looked ready to argue, but Harding held up a hand. "Let's just check the cameras first." His voice was level, logical. "If we have video proof, there's no need to escalate." A long, tense silence followed. Finally, Ramirez let out a short breath and gave a stiff nod. "Fine. Let's check. The barista led them behind the counter, where a small security monitor displayed a grainy but clear view of the cafe. With a few clicks, he rewound the footage to just minutes earlier. Everyone watched in silence. There was Rebecca, sitting at her table, her phone clearly visible beside her coffee cup. Then, she stood up to grab a napkin from the counter. As she did, her elbow nudged the phone, sending it sliding off the edge of the table, straight into her own open bag, resting on the floor. A collective realization dawned over the room. Nobody had taken anything. The phone had been in her bag the entire time. Darius had never even touched it. A heavy silence filled the space. Rebecca's face went ghost white. "Oh my God," she whispered. Darius felt something between vindication and exhaustion settle in his chest. He had known the truth all along, but now everyone else did too. The officers exchanged looks. Harding's face remained impassive, but Ramirez's jaw tightened. He turned slowly toward Rebecca. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now measured. "You told us you were certain he stole it." Rebecca swallowed, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. I really thought." "No," Darius's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You didn't think. You assumed." Rebecca opened her mouth to defend herself, but what could she say? "I was scared. It was just a mistake. I didn't mean to." None of it would erase the humiliation he had just endured. The officers turned back to him. Harding was the one who spoke. "Sir, I think we've got what we need here." Darius let out a short, humorless chuckle. "You think?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You were ready to search me, detain me, over nothing. Over a lie." Ramirez shifted uncomfortably, his previous certainty evaporating. Rebecca's voice was small. I didn't mean for it to." Darius turned on her, his frustration bubbling over. "You didn't mean for what? For the police to get involved? For me to be humiliated? For things to go further than you expected?" He shook his head. "You didn't think about what could have happened to me, because you never had to." Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes, but they did nothing to move him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Darius stared at her for a long moment. And then, with a cold, empty chuckle, he turned away. "Doesn't change what you did." Silence stretched between them. The barista finally broke it. "I think we're done here." The officers nodded. Harding gave Darius a small, almost apologetic nod before turning toward Rebecca. "Ma'am, we're going to need to take a statement from you." Rebecca blinked. "A statement?" "For filing a false police report," Harding clarified. Her breath hitched. "Wait. No, I didn't mean to." "You falsely accused someone of a crime," Harding said. "That has consequences." Darius watched her panic, but he felt nothing. No satisfaction. No relief. Just tiredness. Because for every case like his that had proof, there were 100 more that didn't. The security footage saved him. But what if it hadn't? The cafe had fallen into a heavy, suffocating silence. The weight of the truth hung over everyone like an invisible storm cloud, crackling with tension. Rebecca Langley, her face pale, her hands trembling, stared at the officers, struggling to process what was happening. "A false police report," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't lie." Darius exhaled sharply, a dry laugh escaping him. "You didn't." He gestured toward the security footage still frozen on the screen, an irrefutable witness to the truth. "You swore you saw me take your phone. You called the police. And now that you've been proven wrong, you want to act like it was just an honest mistake." Rebecca flinched as if the words had struck her. I really believed." Her voice trailed off. What defense did she have? Officer Harding, the taller and seemingly more level-headed of the two officers, sighed. "Ma'am, belief and facts aren't the same thing. What you did could have had serious consequences." Rebecca turned toward him, her expression desperate. "I wasn't trying to get him in trouble." Darius scoffed, crossing his arms. "That's exactly what you did." His voice carried a sharp edge, years of frustration compacted into those few words. The cafe patrons were still watching, eyes darting between Darius, Rebecca, and the officers. Some looked embarrassed, as if realizing they had been complicit in their silence. Others looked uncomfortable, as if hoping to distance themselves from what had just happened. Then, from the corner of the cafe, a deep voice spoke up. This could have been bad. All eyes shifted toward the speaker, a middle-aged black man sitting near the window. He wore a neatly pressed button-up shirt, his fingers tapping idly against his coffee cup. His expression was unreadable, but his tone carried the weight of knowing. This could have gone very bad, he repeated, locking eyes with Rebecca. She shrank under the intensity of his gaze. You called the cops on a black man over a hunch. The man continued, his voice eerily calm. You didn't have proof. You didn't even check your own bag first. You just decided he was guilty. He let out a small, bitter chuckle. What do you think happens in situations like that? Rebecca swallowed hard, her hands gripping her arms. Darius didn't need to hear the answer. He already knew. Cops arrive. Accusations are made. Voices escalate. And then, suddenly, a black man is in handcuffs, or worse. If there hadn't been security footage, if there hadn't been cameras, if there hadn't been witnesses willing to second-guess Rebecca's story, would he have been arrested? Would he have been another headline? Would his life have changed forever, all because of one woman's fear-driven assumption? The thought made Darius's stomach twist. Ramirez, the officer who had initially been more aggressive, cleared his throat. Look, we get called to situations like this all the time. Sometimes people are mistaken. Darius snapped his gaze to him. Mistaken? His voice was sharp, filled with barely contained frustration. That's what you call this? Ramirez hesitated, but Harding stepped in, his voice gentler. I think what Officer Ramirez means is that we see false reports more often than you'd think. Some are intentional, some aren't. But the result is the same. Someone gets falsely accused, and if there's no evidence to clear them, it can change their entire life. Darius stared at him, surprised by the admission. Harding met his gaze, and there was something in his expression, something that looked like understanding. Ramirez, however, was less willing to concede. We still had to investigate. That's our job. Darius let out a humorless laugh. Investigate? You were ready to search me before even checking the footage. His voice was tight with anger. You know why that is, right? Ramirez's jaw tightened. Sir, we respond to calls based on the information we're given. Darius cut him off. No, you responded based on who you were looking at. He pointed to himself. A black man, sitting alone, in a public space. His words were cold, deliberate. If I looked different, if my skin was lighter, would you have been so quick to assume I was guilty? The question hung in the air, thick with unspoken truths. Ramirez didn't answer. He didn't need to. The cafe was still. Even those who had been trying to distance themselves from the situation were now fully engaged, watching with wide eyes, their discomfort evident. Rebecca, still frozen in place, looked like she wanted to disappear. Finally, Officer Harding exhaled. Look, I understand why you're upset. He paused, as if searching for the right words. And you're right. This should have been handled differently. Darius blinked, caught off guard. Harding continued. I can't change what happened here today, but I can tell you that this, he gestured around the room, happens way too often. And most of the time, there isn't footage to prove the accused person's innocence. He glanced at Rebecca. And that's why false accusations have consequences. Rebecca stiffened. You're really going to charge me? Her voice was small, almost pleading. Darius felt a fresh wave of frustration. The audacity. She had nearly ruined his life, and now she wanted sympathy? Harding was firm. You made a serious accusation. You called the police. And you gave a false statement. He sighed. It's not up to us to decide whether charges will stick, but we have to document the situation. Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes. It was a mistake, she whispered. Darius exhaled slowly. Yeah, and I could have paid for your mistake with my freedom. A long silence followed. Then, the older black man by the window spoke again, his voice softer this time. You don't get it yet, do you? He looked at Rebecca. You're lucky. He's lucky. Because this time, it ended with embarrassment. But next time, it might not. Rebecca's gaze dropped to the floor, shame radiating off her in waves. Harding turned back to Darius. Sir, do you want to press charges? Darius hesitated. He had every right to. A small part of him wanted her to feel the same fear, the same helplessness that he had felt when those officers walked in and immediately assumed the worst. But then what would it change? Rebecca's life wouldn't be ruined. She'd probably get a fine, maybe some community service. And even if she did face consequences, would it stop the next woman from making the same mistake? Would it stop the next Darius from going through the same nightmare? His jaw tightened. No, he finally said. Rebecca's eyes snapped up in surprise. Even the officers looked mildly taken aback. No, Harding echoed. Darius shook his head. I don't need to press charges. He turned toward Rebecca, his voice low but unwavering. But I need you to understand something. Rebecca swallowed, nodding hesitantly. You were scared today, Darius said. I get that. But you weren't scared of me. You were scared of the idea of me. The version of me you made up in your head. His voice was steady, each word carrying weight. And that's what almost got me arrested. Rebecca's breath hitched. She said nothing. Darius exhaled. Next time, before you assume, before you react, think. Because next time, his gaze was piercing. There might not be a security camera to save the person you accuse. Silence. Rebecca gave the smallest of nods, her lips pressed tightly together. Darius turned away. He had nothing else to say to her. Darius stepped out of the cafe, inhaling deeply as the crisp afternoon air hit his skin. His heart was still pounding, his hands still slightly shaky from the adrenaline coursing through him. It didn't matter how many times it happened, being accused, being judged before even speaking, feeling the weight of assumptions pressing down on him like an invisible cage. But this time, he had walked away. This time, he had proof. As he stood outside, a voice called out behind him. Hey man. Darius turned. The older black man who had spoken inside the cafe was stepping toward him, hands in his pockets, his gaze steady. That was heavy, the man said, nodding toward the cafe. Darius let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, you could say that. The man studied him for a moment before extending a hand. James Coleman. Darius shook his hand. Darius Walker. James nodded. You handled that well in there. Darius scoffed. Did I? Because it sure didn't feel like it. James smirked, leaning slightly against the cafe's brick wall. You kept your cool. That's more than a lot of folks would have done. His expression grew serious. But I know that wasn't the first time something like this has happened to you. Darius sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Nope. James exhaled through his nose. Me neither. He shook his head. Different time, different place, but the same old story. Darius looked at him, curious. What happened? James hesitated, then gave a small, bitter chuckle. Years ago, I was fresh out of college. Got a job at this fancy office downtown. One day, a woman's purse went missing. She looked around, couldn't find it, and next thing I know, security is at my desk, asking me to come with them. His jaw clenched. No one asked anyone else. Just me. Darius felt a familiar sting of anger. Did they find it? James nodded, a grim smile on his face. Yeah, under her own damn desk. He shook his head. She didn't apologize. Just laughed it off. Oh, silly me. And everyone went right back to work, like it never happened. Darius exhaled sharply. He knew that feeling. James looked at him. Difference is, back then, there weren't cameras everywhere like there are now. I didn't have proof. I just had to swallow it and move on. Darius frowned. That's messed up. James nodded. Yeah, but it's reality. He sighed. What happened to you today? It's not just about one woman making a mistake. It's about why she made that mistake. Why her first instinct was to see you as a threat. Darius clenched his jaw. He had spent his whole life knowing that people saw him a certain way before he even opened his mouth. A stranger. A danger. A suspect before a person. James studied him. So what now? Darius raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? James shrugged. You could walk away from this, try to forget about it. Or you could do something with it. Darius frowned. Do something? James nodded. Man, you just went through something a lot of people go through every day. But unlike most, you had cameras to back you up. You have a voice. He gestured around them. People are watching this stuff happen more and more. But what they do with that knowledge, that's up to people like you. Darius considered his words. For most of his life, he had just dealt with it. Pushed forward. Told himself it wasn't worth fighting every single battle because it would only exhaust him. But now, he had proof. He had a story people needed to hear. A thought formed in his mind, one he hadn't considered before. What if I tell it, he murmured. James raised an eyebrow. Tell what? Darius looked up. My story. This story. Not just mine, but everyone's. His mind was racing now. People see these things happen on the news or on social media, but then they forget. They move on. But what if I make sure they don't? James smirked. Now you're thinking. Darius's pulse quickened. He had always wanted to do something that mattered, something that could actually change things. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was where it started. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a flood of notifications. People had already started talking about the incident. The security footage was out. Somebody in the cafe must have uploaded it, and now it was spreading. His story was already being told. Now he just had to decide how to shape it. The next morning, Darius woke up to hundreds of notifications. His name was everywhere. Someone from the cafe had uploaded the security footage to social media, and within hours, it had gone viral. The video had been shared thousands of times, with captions like, "Red Circle Black Man Falsely Accused. Proof Clears His Name." Red Circle, she called the cops on him for no reason. Watch what happens next. Red Circle, how many more times will this happen before we learn? News outlets had already picked up the story. His inbox was flooded with messages, some from reporters wanting interviews, others from strangers who had been in his shoes. People were talking, and for the first time, they weren't just moving on. Darius scrolled through the comments. This could have been another innocent man locked up. Thank God for cameras. The worst part? If there was no footage, he probably wouldn't be believed. This happens way more than people realize. I went through the exact same thing. That woman should face real consequences. I hope he sues. Then, mixed among the support, were the usual skeptics. Maybe she really thought he stole it. Not everything is about race. Why is this news? People make mistakes. At least she didn't call the cops and lie on purpose. Get over it. Darius exhaled, setting his phone down. He wasn't surprised. These conversations always went the same way. Some people got it. Others never would. But this time, something felt different. People were listening. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he opened it, James stood there, coffee in hand. "Thought you might need this," James said, handing him a cup. Darius smirked. "You always just show up with coffee for people?" James shrugged. "I've been in your shoes. Figured you could use a conversation that wasn't happening through a screen." Darius stepped aside, letting him in. "Well, come on in then, wise mentor." James chuckled, taking a seat at the small kitchen table. "So, how does it feel to be the latest viral sensation?" Darius ran a hand through his hair. "Exhausting." James nodded. "It always is." Darius took a sip of coffee, his mind still racing. "People want me to do interviews. A lawyer reached out. Some activists want to connect. It's a lot." James leaned forward. "And what do you want to do?" Darius hesitated. That was the real question, wasn't it? For years, he had felt like these things just happened to him. He had learned to survive them, to navigate the unspoken rules of being a black man in public spaces. Stay calm. Don't argue. Don't make them feel threatened, even when you're the one in danger. But now, for once, he had power over the story. "I want to do something that matters," Darius said finally. "Something that makes this about more than just me." James smiled. "Then do it." Darius frowned. "Yeah, but how?" James took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "You start by speaking. By sharing. Not just online, but out there." He gestured toward the window. "People are already listening. Give them something worth listening to." Darius exhaled. Could he really do this? Could he turn his moment into something that changed things for others? The answer came before he even had time to second-guess it. Yes, and he was about to prove it. 1 month later, the community center was packed. Rows of chairs filled the room, every seat taken. People stood along the walls, some leaning against the back, others craning their necks to see. Darius took a deep breath from behind the curtain. He hadn't expected this many people to show up. He looked over at James, who gave him an encouraging nod. "You got this." Darius exhaled. "Guess we're about to find out." Then, he stepped onto the stage. The murmuring crowd quieted. Darius adjusted the mic, scanning the faces in front of him. Young men who had probably lived through the same fears he had. Parents who worried about their sons every time they walked out the door. Even people like Rebecca. People who had never faced these experiences but were here to listen. He cleared his throat. "I want to start with a question," he said. His voice was steady, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The crowd waited. "How many of you have ever been accused of something you didn't do?" Hands shot up all across the room. Darius nodded. He wasn't alone. "This isn't just my story," he continued. "It's a story that's played out over and over, on sidewalks, in stores, in schools, in offices. Sometimes, it ends with an apology. Other times, it ends with a life ruined." A heavy silence filled the room. He swallowed hard. Time to say what needed to be said. We have to stop treating these moments like they're just accidents. Like they don't have real consequences. He took a breath. "I was lucky. I had proof. But what happens to the people who don't? He let the question linger. Someone in the audience whispered, "They go to jail." Darius nodded. "Yeah, or worse." The room was dead silent. Then, he continued. "So what do we do about it?" A pause. Then, a voice from the back. "We tell the truth." Darius nodded. "Exactly." He looked out at the crowd, feeling something shift inside him. This is about more than one incident. It's about changing how we see each other, how we react, how we stop assuming and start listening. He exhaled. "And that starts here." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Darius took one last breath. This can't just be another viral video that people forget in a week. His voice was firm now. This has to be a wake-up call. Applause filled the room. Darius stepped back, letting it sink in. For the first time in a long time, he didn't just feel like someone a story happened to. He felt like someone who could change the story. And that was just the beginning.